Hi everyone, my name is Serena Sandweiss. I am from New Haven, Connecticut, and I have been interning here at the center helping out with communications and social media this summer. So I recently finished reading The Art of Activism, which is our founder's amazing book all about artistic activism. And as someone who's always been really fascinated with pop culture and politics and all the different ways they intersect, I was really struck by the chapter all about culture. And in order to learn more about how culture can influence our activism on a personal level, I wanted to try out some of the workbook exercises that are mentioned in the book, and I figured I'd take you guys along with me to demonstrate just how easy these activities are and how they can be such a great inspiration which can influence your own activism. So, join me, your host, as we journey out into the world together on 3 pop culture field trips. Over these next 3 videos, I'm going to explore both capital C and small c culture, and everything in between, as I strive to gain inspiration and insight into activism here at home as a 21-year-old college student, so if I can do it here, you can do it anywhere. I'll be exploring everything from the paintings of John Trumbull to K-pop mania, and you can too! These exercises are super easy and fun, but also very effective ways to gain inspiration and develop your own practice as an activist right from home. So I hope that after watching, you'll be inspired to join along and try some of these out yourself. So before we begin exploring culture, we should probably first establish what we mean by that word. Well, it's probably safe to assume that anyone who's interested in artistic activism is also probably at least slightly interested in art, even if you're not a painter or a performer yourself. Culture is more than simply seeing a critically acclaimed play off Broadway or viewing a Van Gogh. Stuart Hall, who's the founder of the academic discipline of cultural studies, breaks down culture into 2 parts with this handy description: capital C culture, or culture as art, and small c culture, culture as life. Both these forms of culture influence each other, as demonstrated in this handy illustration from the Art of Activism. Now that we've got that covered, without further ado, let's dive into our first exercise. If you're following along at home, turn to exercise 19 in your workbook and let's go on a field trip. So this exercise asks us to explore the relationship between the 2 forms of culture we just covered by visiting a museum to determine what we can learn about a society's culture through its art, and vice versa. For this activity, I knew exactly where to go. Luckily enough for me, my hometown is also home to Yale University, and as such, I've been super fortunate to grow up in an environment where capital C culture is easily accessible to me. However, if you're following along at home from somewhere with less access to wonderful free art museums, don't panic. You can still do this exercise just as easily online through museum websites. I recommend the Met, who's digitized almost their entire massive collection and made it available for free on their website. But enough talking, let's go! Alright guys, I'm here at the Yale Art Gallery. I have my handy notebook and my clicky pen, and I am going to try out our first artistic activism exercise. I made my way inside and wandered around my favorite sections of the museum for a while, and even saw some pop culture favorites, like this Warhol painting, and there was even a Slinky on display. But soon I found myself migrating to the gallery of early American art, where I was immediately drawn to this landscape painting by John Trumbull. While Trumbull might be better known as the painter of these famous murals all about the American Revolution, which hang in the rotunda of the Capitol building, the original designs of which are actually right over here, it was this landscape, view on the West Mountain near Hartford from 1791, which grabbed my eye. So, like the workbook says, I stood in front of the painting for several minutes and tried to jot down everything I noticed about the culture of the artist and society that valued it. So I have my notes here from the art gallery, and with the questions from the workbook that I answered, which are: what sort of culture produced this culture? What can we say about the culture of the artist and the society that valued it? And what ideas or ideals is the artist communicating to the audience? So for this first question, I took a look around the gallery as a whole, and I was very struck by the idea that this artwork is the product of a young society that was really beginning to develop its own culture, and it had a lot of ideas about itself. So some of these paintings are pre-revolution and some are post, but to me, all of them convey a desire to create an American identity. So many of these portraits of early Americans highlight their wealth and their status by emulating European aesthetics and art styles, which maybe speaks to the desire of these wealthy members of colonial society to fashion themselves in the manner of old world elites. And there are classical elements all over this gallery, from federal-style architecture in the background of portraits to the very, very visible Greek and Roman influence in busts of important figures. And even my chosen painting emulates the styles and the tradition of European landscape painting. So this leads me to think that, in my opinion, the culture that produced this culture was a colonial society that was in the process of emerging into its own new nation. And as such, I think there's a very visible desire to start cementing the status of its elites through appeals to European aesthetics and the old world, so the old elites. And also, I think that you can see that early Americans were starting to create myths about themselves and starting to cement some ideas of American identity, which you can even see still today. So I think other ideas about the New World are also certainly coming through in this painting, which leads us to our second question, which is, what can we say about the culture of the artist or society that valued this artwork? So in my opinion, this painting reveals a lot about the relationship between early Americans and their natural landscape. So there's this very pristine, untouched conception of the New World, which I think really comes through in this painting. So, in fact, there were already Native Americans living here long before any Europeans got here. And also, the reality of life for American colonists was not exactly peaceful or pristine. You couldn't really tell either of these things from this very romantic, really beautiful depiction of the natural environment of New England, with the farm animals grazing placidly on a hilltop and the beautiful sunset. I think that that really speaks to this idea of America as this beautiful natural environment that was untouched and ripe for opportunity. And I think that you can pick up on this ideal of the young nation as well through this central subject. So it's this lone young man, and he's gazing off towards the sun, perhaps towards the west, and it's a very promising image. Finally, for our last question, we're going to think about what ideas or ideals the artist is communicating to the audience. So I think there's a lot that you might say about this work. So there's certainly that sense of promise and possibility that we touched on earlier, and that myth of possibility and conquering the untamed landscape to make something great for yourself. I think that's certainly one of America's core myths as a nation even now. So in this gallery's description of the painting, I learned that Trumbull himself was inspired to paint this scene because he thought it would make a great site for a delightful and magnificent country residence. And maybe the young man in this painting is thinking the same thing himself. So it presents this beautiful, untouched landscape as full of tranquility, natural beauty, despite the fact that people already lived there and that settling this land would spoil the natural beauty. And on that second point, I think that on the other hand, you could maybe even also interpret this artwork as an early form of romanticism. So maybe like a lament of all the natural beauty that would be lost as settlement continued and the nation expanded. So in this way, you could interpret it as contradictory to this mainstream ideal of progress and settlement as really positive, good things. Ultimately, I found this exercise really insightful and super interesting. Examining my chosen painting really in depth and contemplating its relationship with the culture that produced it and trying to discern what ideas the painter was trying to communicate really made me reflect on so many different things. It made me really appreciate how many central aspects of American mythology are present even in the country's earliest artwork. It also made me think about how art can really certainly present mixed messages and conflicting interpretations. And most importantly, this exercise really did make me aware of how art and society really do influence each other, just like in the diagram from the Art of Activism. So I really hope that you'll try this one out and also join me in part 2 for our next pop culture field trip, where we will be exploring K-pop through an interview with my friend Essie.